In the grand marble lobby of the hotel, a black businessman walked in with a modest appearance after a long flight. The female hotel manager immediately judged him by his looks, refused to check his reservation, and publicly humiliated him in front of the crowd. But she had no idea that he was the new owner of the entire hotel chain, and what happened next would make her regret it. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. The late afternoon light streamed through the soaring glass panels of the Silver Crown Regent's grand lobby, casting long amber reflections across the polished marble floor. Malcolm Reed stepped in from the cold New York air, the heavy glass door closing behind him with a muffled thud. He paused for just a heartbeat, letting his eyes adjust to the golden glow that bathed the cavernous space. A towering crystal chandelier sparkled above, each facet catching the light like 1,000 tiny suns. Wealth hung in the air here, not just in the imported stone and gilded fixtures, but in the way the guests moved, in the quiet hush of money being at home. He walked with the steady, measured pace of someone used to being in charge, though his appearance told a different story today. Dark jeans, neat but far from designer. A linen shirt, open at the collar, a leather jacket softened and creased from years of wear, the kind of garment that carried its own history. His carry-on rolled quietly behind him, the wheels whispering over the marble. He had just stepped off a transatlantic flight from London, his shoulders carrying the fatigue of 12 cramped hours and the quiet satisfaction of a job completed overseas. Behind the reception desk stood Eleanor Price, a tall woman with an air of contained authority. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe twist, her tailored charcoal suit crisp and precise. She had run the Silver Crown Regent for over a decade, and she carried herself as if the hotel's reputation was her own personal inheritance. When she looked up and saw Malcolm approaching, her eyes swept over him from head to toe. There was no smile, just a swift calculating scan that settled into a faint tightening around her mouth. Malcolm set his bag at his side and offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon. I have a reservation under Reed Group." Eleanor did not move to her keyboard. Instead, she folded her hands lightly on the counter, her nails gleaming in the warm light. Her voice, when it came, was smooth and controlled, the kind of tone cultivated to sound refined. "Sir," she began, "I believe you may be more comfortable at another hotel. There's a property a few blocks down that might suit you better." Her words were wrapped in courtesy, but the undertone was sharp enough to cut. A murmur rustled through the lobby. A man in an expensive navy blazer turned his head. A woman with a pearl necklace leaned toward her companion, eyes narrowing. Malcolm felt their gazes like spotlights, trained and unblinking. He kept his voice even. "If you could please check your system, you'll see my reservation, Reed Group. It should be for tonight." Eleanor's expression remained unchanged, though her eyes seemed to harden. "There's no need to check, sir. We maintain a certain standard here, and I think it's best if you find accommodations elsewhere." It was not what she said, but how she said it, the delicate emphasis on standard, the way her gaze lingered on his clothes, the way she seemed to be addressing not just him but the invisible audience of onlookers. Malcolm caught the quick exchange of approving glances between two older guests near the end. He felt the familiar tension coil in his chest, the one that had surfaced in boardrooms and restaurants and country clubs. But his posture didn't change. "I'm sure it will only take a moment to confirm my booking." Eleanor straightened, her chin lifting slightly. "Mr. Reed," something flickered in her eyes. Recognition perhaps, but it was gone in an instant. "Well, Mr. Reed, without proper attire and the expected presentation, this establishment cannot extend its hospitality. I'll have security assist you." From her right she made a subtle hand gesture, as if brushing away a stray thread. Two uniformed security officers began moving toward the desk, their polished shoes clicking softly against the marble. The taller of the two stopped beside Malcolm, his voice low but firm. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." Malcolm glanced at him, reading the discomfort in the man's eyes. "I have a confirmed reservation," he said, not to plead, but to state a fact. Eleanor's voice carried now, deliberately projecting into the open air of the lobby. "This gentleman will not be staying with us. He does not meet the standards of the Silver Crown Regent and is hereby prohibited from returning to the property." The words hung in the space, heavy and final. A couple by the grand staircase looked on with a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction. A young bellhop froze mid-step, his gaze darting from Malcolm to Eleanor. The two security officers stepped closer, one placing a hand near Malcolm's arm but not touching him yet. He gave a small nod. "Understood," he said quietly, his voice carrying a steadiness that contrasted the scene unfolding around him. He picked up his bag, the handle smooth and familiar in his hand, and began walking toward the glass doors. As he moved, the atmosphere in the lobby shifted. Some guests avoided his eyes, others let theirs linger a second too long. The echo of Eleanor's announcement seemed to follow him, bouncing off the high ceilings and ornate columns. He could hear the faint murmur of approval from somewhere behind him, the sound of judgment dressed as decorum. When the door opened and the chill air rushed in, he stepped into it without breaking stride, the security officers just behind him. The gleam of the marble lobby faded behind the glass, replaced by the muted tones of the street outside. Inside, Eleanor turned back to her desk with the composure of someone who believed she had just preserved the sanctity of her domain. Outside, Malcolm stood for a moment on the sidewalk, the hotel's name etched in brass above him, the city's late-day traffic humming around his thoughts. The sting was not new, but it burned nonetheless. This was not the first time, and he knew it would not be the last, but even in that moment, standing under the cold glow of the Silver Crown Regent's facade, something inside him was already shifting. The wind outside carried the chill of early winter, sharp enough to sting the skin. Malcolm stood just beyond the hotel's gleaming brass doors, his breath rising in pale clouds against the darkening sky. The Silver Crown Regent loomed behind him, its name carved deep into the polished stone facade, every letter catching the fading light. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and scrolled to a familiar name. When Alicia Gomez answered, her voice was quick and steady, the voice of someone who understood urgency without explanation. Malcolm kept his tone even, almost casual, though the steel in his words was unmistakable. "Alicia, activate the acquisition announcement for Silver Crown immediately. Push it to every major outlet, and set up an emergency call with the Regent Luxury Group board within the next 20 minutes. There was the sound of rapid typing on her end, before she replied, "Understood." "And Malcolm, just to confirm, we finalized the purchase of the entire Regent Luxury Group 48 hours ago through Mariner Holdings. It's ours." He allowed himself the smallest nod, though no one was there to see it. "Good, let's make sure everyone inside knows it." The call ended, and he slipped the phone back into his pocket. The street bustled around him, horns blaring, a vendor calling out from a corner cart, a taxi idling as the driver leaned on the steering wheel. He remained still, a figure of deliberate patience, watching the revolving glass doors. Inside, guests moved between the lobby and the elevators, oblivious to the tremor about to hit their curated world. 5 minutes passed, then another 3. Phones began to chime, faintly at first, a sound like a distant alarm growing louder. Someone near the windows glanced down at their screen, frowned and nudged their companion. A suited man in the corner bar froze with his drink halfway to his lips, eyes darting to the headline glowing on his phone. Within minutes, the ripple became a wave, conversations shifted, whispers weaving through the lobby. A woman in a fur-trimmed coat leaned toward her husband, her voice sharp with disbelief. "It says Reed Global Hospitality just bought the Regent chain. That's this hotel." Across the marble floor, a young bellhop straightened, his hand tightening around the handle of a luggage cart. Malcolm pushed the door open and stepped back into the lobby, his shoes clicking against the marble in a slow, unhurried rhythm. The air inside was warmer, but charged now, filled with the uneasy hum of realization. He walked toward the reception desk, eyes sweeping over the space, catching snippets of conversation, his name, the words CEO, acquisition, worth millions. Guests shifted in their seats. A man near the fireplace reached for his phone, angling it just enough to capture the scene. Eleanor stood behind the desk, still poised, still wearing that polished air of control. She was speaking to a middle-aged couple, her voice warm and smooth, the perfect mask of hospitality. But the slightest tension in her shoulders betrayed that she had heard the murmurs. She glanced up as Malcolm approached, her expression tightening for the briefest instant before smoothing over again. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice neutral, "I thought we had settled your accommodations matter." He stopped directly in front of the desk, resting one hand lightly on the polished surface. "Not quite. I believe you'll want to check your system again. I have a reservation under Reed Group." His tone was courteous, but his eyes were steady, unblinking. Eleanor's gaze flicked to the young receptionist beside her, a man in his 20s whose fingers hovered nervously above the keyboard. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, but he glanced between the two of them, uncertainty written across his face. Around them, the quiet of the lobby began to shift into the fragile stillness that comes when a room senses the approach of something inevitable. "I assure you, sir," Eleanor said, her smile tightening, "our earlier assessment remains unchanged." Before Malcolm could speak, the receptionist's voice cut in, low but carrying just enough to be heard by those nearest. "It's here," he said, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen. "Reservation for Reed Group, penthouse suite." The pause that followed felt like the air being drawn from the room. The security officer from earlier, still stationed a few steps away, shifted his weight, his brows drawing together. Someone near the bar whispered, "That's him, that's the guy in the news." Another guest, phone raised discreetly, angled for a clearer view. Malcolm did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Eleanor, I suggest we continue this conversation with the understanding that I am now the chief executive officer of the company that owns this hotel. So perhaps we start fresh, and you check me in properly." His words were measured, without edge, but their weight landed with perfect precision. Eleanor blinked, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. The receptionist's eyes flicked to her, then back to Malcolm, his hands already moving to complete the check-in. Behind them, the lobby had fallen into a hush, broken only by the quiet clicks of camera phones capturing the moment. The receptionist's fingers stilled on the keyboard, as the air in the lobby thickened with anticipation. Malcolm remained where he was, one hand resting on the polished counter, the other slipping his phone from his jacket pocket with deliberate calm. His thumb found the contact he wanted, and in moments the screen lit with the face of Charles Denning, chairman of the board for Regent Luxury Group. Malcolm turned the phone so the camera caught him and the lobby behind, then tapped the speaker icon so that every word would carry. The soft hum of the chandelier's crystal pendants seemed louder now, as if the room itself was holding its breath. "Charles," Malcolm began, his voice measured but resonant enough to carry across the marble expanse, "I'm calling from the lobby of the Silver Crown Regent, your flagship property. I've just had an encounter with the general manager here that you and the rest of the board will want to hear in detail." A murmur rippled through the guests seated near the fireplace, phones lifted discreetly, eyes darted from Malcolm to Eleanor, who stood rigid behind the desk. "Go ahead, Malcolm," Denning's voice replied through the speaker, deep and tinged with curiosity. Malcolm recounted the events with surgical precision. He described walking in after a long flight, the polite request for his reservation to be checked, the refusal without a glance at the system, the repeated insinuations that he did not meet the hotel's standards, and finally the public ejection under the watch of approving guests. He made no embellishments. The stark clarity of each detail was enough to pull every ear closer. His words were steady, but the underlying sting was impossible to miss, a quiet reminder that dignity denied leaves its mark. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. She interjected once, her tone clipped. "That's a mischaracterization. My responsibility is to protect the quality of our guests' experience." Malcolm didn't raise his voice, but the slight pause he gave before continuing was enough to still hers. "Charles, I believe you'll find my account is supported by the hotel's own security footage and multiple witnesses present right now." He tilted the phone just slightly so the camera caught the cluster of guests nearby, some of whom nodded almost imperceptibly. A quiet chime from his phone signaled a new message. Malcolm glanced down, recognizing Alicia's name. He opened it and found a file waiting, a concise dossier in PDF format, neatly organized and damning. "Charles," he said, "I've just received Eleanor Price's personnel record. Would you like to hear what's in it?" There was a faint rustle over the speaker before Denning answered, "Go ahead." Malcolm scrolled through the file, his eyes moving over each line. 14 separate complaints of discriminatory conduct in the past 2 years. 5 confidential settlements totaling over $400,000. Patterns noted in guest demographics under her management, specifically, repeated reports from guests of color being denied service or given substandard treatment. The settlements, by the way, were executed under non-disclosure agreements. Gasps broke the hush in the lobby. A man in a tailored gray suit near the elevator exchanged a startled look with his companion. The receptionist at Eleanor's side shifted his weight from foot to foot, his gaze fixed on the screen as though reading along in his mind. Eleanor's cheeks flushed, her posture stiffening as she searched for footing. "Those were misunderstandings," she said, her voice tightening. "Every one of those situations was resolved to the satisfaction of the company. My record speaks for itself." Malcolm looked directly at her. "It does, Eleanor. And right now it's speaking louder than anything you can say. This is not an isolated moment, it's a pattern, and patterns have consequences." A movement at the edge of the crowd drew his eye. A couple stepped forward, a man in a deep navy suit and a woman in a champagne-colored dress, both elegant, composed. Their skin was the same warm brown as Malcolm's, their expressions carrying the weight of recognition. The woman spoke first, her voice quiet but clear. "Mr. Reed, thank you. 2 months ago we stayed here for our anniversary. Miss Price barely looked at us when we checked in. Our requests for simple things like an extra blanket were delayed for hours. We thought maybe we were imagining it, but now, I see we weren't." The man beside her nodded, adding, "It was subtle but it was there. We didn't complain because we didn't think anyone would care." Malcolm inclined his head toward them, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second. "I care, and this company will care moving forward." He turned the phone back toward himself and the desk, his voice resuming its precise cadence. "Charles, as CEO of Reed Global Hospitality and now of Regent Luxury Group, I am making an immediate personnel decision." Eleanor's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. "You can't." "I can," Malcolm said, cutting through her protest with the same steady tone he had held from the start. "Effective immediately, Eleanor Price is terminated from her position as General Manager of the Silver Crown Regent for gross violation of company policy, including documented acts of discrimination detrimental to business operations. This decision is made in consultation with the board, whose chairman is listening right now." Denning's voice came through the speaker, low but decisive. "The board will support that decision. It's in line with our code of conduct and legal obligations." The receptionist's hands froze over the keyboard. The security officer from earlier straightened, his eyes moving between Malcolm and Eleanor. Guests shifted in their seats, a few raising their phones higher to capture every word. Eleanor took a half step back from the desk, her composure slipping. "You're making a mistake. My tenure here has brought nothing but prestige to this hotel. You don't understand the clientele." Malcolm's gaze locked on hers, unwavering. "I understand them better than you think, and I understand that prestige built on exclusion isn't prestige at all, it's prejudice with better furniture." The words landed with an audible weight, a quiet spread through the lobby, the kind that signals the end of one chapter and the start of another. The chandelier's light glinted on Eleanor's fixed expression, her jaw set but her eyes betraying the cracks in her certainty. Malcolm glanced at the couple who had spoken up, then back to the rest of the room. "Let this be clear to everyone here, guests, staff and board members alike. The culture of this hotel changes today. Dignity and respect are not optional amenities, they are the foundation of hospitality. Anyone unwilling to uphold that will find no place here." The couple exchanged a small grateful look. The receptionist exhaled quietly, his fingers moving again, this time completing Malcolm's check-in without hesitation. The security officer stepped back to his post, his stance easing just slightly. Eleanor remained standing behind the desk, the center of a moment she could no longer control. Malcolm ended the call with Denning, the phone screen going dark in his hand. The murmur of the lobby began to rise again, but the undercurrent had shifted. The authority in the room no longer belonged to Eleanor, it was Malcolm's now and everyone knew it. 3 months later the winter sky hung low and gray over the city as Eleanor Price stepped out of a black sedan in front of the State Labor Arbitration Building. The cold wind caught the edges of her navy wool coat, pulling it back just enough to reveal the sharp lines of her tailored suit. She clutched a leather portfolio in one gloved hand, the other buried in her pocket, her eyes fixed straight ahead. At her side walked her attorney, Martin Keller, a man with steel-gray hair and a voice honed in countless hearing rooms. He spoke in a low tone meant to reassure, but the tension in Eleanor's jaw made it clear his words weren't reaching her. Inside, the hearing room was plain but carried the heavy weight of consequence. A long table divided the space, with the tribunal's three-person panel seated at the far end beneath the state seal. Judge Margaret Hollis, the presiding officer, adjusted her glasses as she reviewed the docket, her sharp gaze scanning the room over the rim. To the left sat Eleanor and her attorney, their papers neatly stacked. To the right, Malcolm Reed, flanked by his legal counsel and a representative from Reed Global Hospitality's Compliance Division. His posture was as composed as it had been the night in the hotel lobby, calm, deliberate, and unshakable. The proceedings began with Keller's opening statement. He spoke of Eleanor's 15 years in luxury hospitality, of performance awards and glowing guest reviews, painting her dismissal as a gross overreaction to a momentary misunderstanding. He emphasized that no explicit language had been used that day, framing the incident as a clash of expectations rather than prejudice. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the panel, nodding slightly at each point, as if willing the narrative into place. When it was Malcolm's turn, his attorney rose and spoke with measured precision. She described not just the incident, but the documented history behind it. She laid out the timeline of complaints, the 5 confidential settlements, and the consistent pattern of exclusionary behavior reported by both guests and staff. As she spoke, Malcolm remained still, his hands folded loosely on the table, his gaze moving between the panel and Eleanor without hostility but with an unmistakable gravity. Then came the evidence. A large monitor was wheeled into the room, and the grainy footage from the hotel's security cameras played for the panel. The sound was faint but clear enough to hear Eleanor's voice as she refused to check Malcolm's reservation, her choice of words laced with quiet dismissal. The panel members watched without comment, but the subtle tightening around Judge Hollis's mouth said enough. Next, the witness statements began. The couple who had stepped forward in the lobby that night sat at the witness table, recounting their own experience with Eleanor, how their special occasion had been overshadowed by the cool indifference that met their every request. Their tone was calm, but the undercurrent of hurt was impossible to miss. 2 former employees followed. 1, a front desk clerk, spoke of being instructed to redirect certain walk-in guests based on appearance. Another, a housekeeping supervisor, described a climate where staff of color were often given less favorable shifts and slower promotion tracks. Each statement added another layer to the picture forming in the panel's minds. Eleanor's attorney attempted to counter. He questioned the reliability of memories months after the fact, suggested that guest dissatisfaction could stem from unrelated issues, and pointed out that no formal disciplinary action had been taken against Eleanor prior to this. Eleanor herself took the stand briefly, her voice steady but tinged with an edge of indignation. She maintained that she had been following the unspoken standards of high-end hospitality and insisted that any offense caused was unintended. Malcolm's side responded with quiet efficiency. They presented internal memos recovered from Regent Luxury Group's archives, notes that hinted at maintaining a refined clientele and upholding exclusivity, phrases that seemed innocuous until placed in the context of guest demographics and the complaints on file. The panel members leaned forward as these documents were read aloud, the careful language now stripped of its protective veneer. After hours of testimony, the room settled into a tense silence as Judge Hollis prepared to deliver the panel's decision. She spoke with the kind of authority that comes from decades of weighing facts against human failings. Miss Price, this panel finds the termination of your employment to be justified and lawful. The evidence presented demonstrates a clear pattern of discriminatory conduct in violation of both company policy and state anti-discrimination statutes. Your appeal is hereby denied. You are further ordered to reimburse the respondent for legal costs in the amount of $38,000. The words landed with a finality that left no room for misinterpretation. Eleanor's eyes flickered toward her attorney, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Hollis continued, her tone unwavering. Additionally, this decision will be entered into the statewide hospitality employment record system. You will be ineligible for management positions in licensed high-end hospitality establishments for a period of no less than 10 years. The air in the room seemed to shift. Malcolm's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle release in his shoulders, as though a weight had shifted from his own hands to the hands of the system meant to deliver justice. Eleanor sat rigid, her fingers tightening on the edge of the table, her gaze fixed on some distant point past the panel, as though refusing to see the room she was actually in. The gavel's sharp crack marked the end of the hearing. Papers rustled, chairs slid back, and conversations began in low tones. Malcolm gathered his documents with quiet efficiency, exchanging a few words with his counsel before standing. He didn't look toward Eleanor as he left, but as he passed by, the faint reflection of the hearing room in the polished wood door showed her still sitting motionless, the ruling settling over her like a shadow that would not lift. A year had passed since the tribunal's ruling, and the Silver Crown Regent no longer felt like the same place where that cold December afternoon had unfolded. In the months after Eleanor Price's departure, Malcolm Reed had stood before cameras and in closed boardrooms to announce the launch of the Equity and Dignity Audit across every property in the Regent Luxury Group portfolio. The program, quietly implemented but rigorously enforced, sent trained evaluators undercover as guests from every walk of life: business travelers, families, honeymooners, retirees, each carrying not just a suitcase but the silent responsibility of measuring whether they were met with courtesy or with coded exclusion. Every interaction, from the check-in desk to the housekeeping call, was observed, recorded, and graded. There were no warnings and no second chances for persistent bias. The impact was swift and sometimes uncomfortable. In the first 12 months, 25 managers across multiple cities were replaced, some quietly resigning, others dismissed with cause. Training programs that had once been treated as a formality became immersive, challenging employees to recognize unconscious prejudice and replace it with genuine respect. Guest satisfaction surveys from travelers of color, which had been stagnant for years, rose by 70%. Revenue across the chain climbed 20%, not because the hotels had lowered their standards, but because more people now felt those standards were meant for them too. Other companies were paying attention. Industry trade journals began running profiles on the Dignity Audit model, and competitors who had once dismissed Malcolm's initiative as public relations theater were now requesting consultations to avoid finding themselves in the center of their own viral reckoning. The change was not limited to Regent properties, it was quietly influencing policy across the luxury hospitality sector, shifting the understanding of exclusive from something that locked doors to something that opened them wider. The culmination came at the International Hospitality Leadership Summit, a gathering of executives, owners and policymakers from around the globe. The ballroom was filled with the low murmur of conversation and the quiet clink of glassware as Malcolm took the stage. The lights dimmed slightly, and a large screen behind him displayed an image of the Silver Crown Regent's marble lobby from a year before, a still from the security footage of his first encounter with Eleanor Price. He let the image linger just long enough for the audience to absorb it, the stillness heavy with the memory of what it represented. "When I walked into this hotel that day," he began, his voice carrying evenly across the hushed room, "I was met with something far older than the building itself, a belief that dignity was a privilege, to be given or withheld based on appearance. That belief is not unique to one lobby, or one manager, or one company. It's a shadow that stretches across industries, across continents. But shadows disappear when you bring them into the light." He spoke not just of policy and profit, but of people. He told of the couple who had once endured Eleanor's coldness and returned months later to find themselves greeted by name, their anniversary marked with champagne in their suite. He spoke of Ryan, the young receptionist whose hesitation that day had been replaced with quiet confidence after completing leadership training. Ryan was now the assistant general manager of the Silver Crown Regent. He spoke of Jake, the security officer who had followed orders out of duty but later embraced the role of protecting not just property but the dignity of those who walked through the doors. Jake now led diversity training for all regional security teams. The audience listened intently, executives leaning forward in their chairs, some scribbling notes, others simply watching. Malcolm ended with a simple truth: hospitality is not about who we let in or keep out, it is about how we make people feel once they're here. The measure of a hotel is not the thread count of its sheets, but the humanity of its welcome. The room rose to its feet in applause that was not the polite kind given to keynote speakers, but the sustained, resonant kind that signals genuine respect. Malcolm stepped away from the podium with a quiet nod, the words now belonging to those who had heard them. Weeks later, on a spring afternoon, Malcolm returned to the Silver Crown Regent. The revolving doors opened to a lobby transformed, not just in decor, though fresh flowers filled the air with a subtle fragrance and sunlight streamed through newly polished glass, but in spirit. The marble gleamed as before, but the air was warmer, filled with the sound of conversation in many accents, the sight of guests of every background moving comfortably through the space. A young family checked in at the desk, the receptionist leaning forward with an easy smile. Nearby, a businesswoman in a hijab accepted a welcome drink from a server whose greeting was genuine, not rehearsed. Ryan noticed Malcolm near the entrance and came forward, extending his hand with the relaxed assurance of someone who had earned his place. "Welcome back, Mr. Reed. Your suite is ready whenever you are." Behind him, Jake offered a nod from his post by the elevator, his presence a reminder that vigilance and welcome could coexist. Malcolm took in the scene slowly, letting the details settle into memory, the easy laughter at the concierge desk, the bellhop crouching to greet a child, the absence of that brittle, watchful air that had once hung over the lobby. This was no longer a place where dignity was rationed, it flowed freely, woven into the fabric of service. He moved toward the elevator, his reflection catching briefly in the glass of the lobby doors. The man who had been shown out of this hotel under suspicion and false courtesy was gone. In his place stood the man who had returned to change it, and in doing so had helped change far more than one building's culture. As the elevator doors slid closed, the last sound he heard from the lobby was the comfortable hum of a place where everyone belonged.